She left her Manhattan fiancé for the Montana cowboy who waited 20 years. Chapter 1. Picture this moment. A successful Manhattan lawyer stands before a community of strangers, wearing a weathered cowboy's hat that feels like it was made for her head. The weight of worn leather carries more than years of honest work, it carries the weight of a choice that will redefine everything she thought she knew about love, belonging, and what it means to truly come home. This is the story of Amaya Wallace, a woman who discovered that sometimes the life you think you want is just preparation for the life you actually need. It's about Wyatt, a man who spent years believing that loving someone meant wanting what's best for them, even when that meant watching them walk away. It's about the moment when two hearts that have been circling each other for decades finally stop pretending that some connections can be outgrown, outsmarted, or safely ignored. How do you choose between the security you've built and the love you never forgot? Between proving yourself in a world that barely sees you and belonging somewhere that's been waiting for you to come home? Sometimes the answer doesn't come in boardrooms or partnership announcements. Sometimes it comes in the form of calloused hands placing a hat on your head in front of an entire community, claiming you as theirs in a way that no contract or engagement ring ever could. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. But let's start at the beginning, with a 6-carat diamond that felt heavier than it should have. The engagement ring caught the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Amaya Wallace's corner office, casting tiny rainbows across the merger documents she'd been staring at for the past hour. 30 floors below, the city pulsed with its usual relentless energy, but for the first time in her 12-year legal career, the view that had once filled her with ambition now left her feeling hollow. Ben Simmons checked every box on paper: Harvard Law, senator's nephew, and the polished presence that commanded boardrooms. Yet after 6 years together, Amaya couldn't shake the feeling that she was living in a beautifully decorated cage, each bar forged from someone else's expectations. He was the golden boy of corporate law, and she was supposed to be the golden girl lucky enough to have caught his attention. So why did she feel like she was slowly suffocating in silk scarves and designer expectations? The answer had crystallized the night before at the Metropolitan Museum's annual fundraiser, during what should have been a triumphant moment. Amaya had just secured a landmark environmental settlement for one of the firm's biggest clients, a victory that had taken 18 months of brutal litigation and had resulted in changes to federal regulations. It was a career-defining win that partners built their legacies on. When Ben introduced her to the museum's board of directors, she'd expected pride, recognition, perhaps even a moment where her accomplishments could speak for themselves. Instead, she got this: "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my beautiful fiancée, Amaya. She's almost as sharp as she is stunning. Almost as sharp." The qualifier had hit her like a physical blow, reducing the months of legal brilliance to a charming footnote to her appearance. When she'd confronted him later in their penthouse apartment, with its stark minimalist decor that felt more like a museum than a home, his response had been even more devastating. "Darling, you're being oversensitive," he'd said without looking up from his tablet, scrolling through emails that were apparently more important than her hurt feelings. Harrison's old school. Sometimes you have to know your audience. You can't expect everyone to be impressed by the same things. Know your audience. As if her professional achievements were something to be managed, hidden, or apologized for depending on who was listening. As if she were a beautiful ornament whose value lay not in her substance but in how well she complemented his image. That's when the truth had hit her with crystal clarity: she wasn't Ben's partner. She was his acquisition. Beautiful enough to enhance his reputation, accomplished enough to suggest good judgment, but never so successful as to overshadow his own achievements. She was living someone else's definition of success, and it was slowly killing everything authentic about who she was. The realization had left her staring at the ceiling until dawn, wondering when she'd stopped fighting for herself and started settling for someone else's version of her worth. The intercom buzzed, startling her from her thoughts. "Ms. Wallace? I have Sheriff Bradley from Montana on line 3. He says it's urgent regarding your family." Amaya's heart stopped. Eleanor. Her great-aunt Eleanor, the woman who'd raised her every summer from age 6 to 17, who'd taught her that strength and gentleness weren't opposites but partners, who'd made her feel like she could conquer the world if she just had enough courage to try. "Ms. Wallace?" Sheriff Bradley's voice was gentle but firm when she picked up the phone. "I'm sorry to be calling with difficult news, but Eleanor passed peacefully in her sleep last night. She left specific instructions that you be contacted immediately." The words seemed to come from very far away, filtering through a haze of shock and grief that made her office suddenly feel like a foreign planet. Eleanor, who'd braided her hair for county fair competitions and taught her to rope cattle before she could drive a car. Eleanor, who'd never once made her feel like she needed to be smaller to make others comfortable. "There's something else," the sheriff continued carefully. "Eleanor left detailed legal documents naming you as her sole heir. The Double E Ranch, all 40,000 acres of it, she's left everything to you. She wanted you to know right away that she hoped you might consider coming home." Home. The word hit her like lightning, bringing with it a flood of memories she'd spent 20 years trying to bury. Summer evenings on the wraparound porch, learning to identify constellations while Eleanor told stories about ancestors who'd built something lasting with nothing but determination and love for the land. Sunrise rides across grassland that stretched to the horizon, making her feel infinite and powerful and completely free. And Wyatt. Always Wyatt, with his quiet strength and eyes the color of Montana sky, who'd made her teenage heart race with possibilities she'd been too young to understand and too scared to explore. 3 hours later, Amaya sat across from Ben in his pristine home office, the engagement ring placed carefully on his mahogany desk between them like evidence in a case neither wanted to argue. "You're not thinking clearly," Ben said, his voice carrying the patronizing patience he reserved for opposing counsel he considered intellectually inferior. "Grief makes people do irrational things. Take a few days, handle the funeral arrangements, deal with the estate business. But don't make any permanent decisions while you're emotional." Emotional. As if her feelings were a temporary inconvenience rather than the clearest signal she'd received in years about what her life had become. "This isn't grief talking, Ben," she said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "This is clarity. I've been sleepwalking through someone else's idea of what my life should look like, and I can't do it anymore. So you're throwing away 6 years, a partnership track, everything we've built together?" His composure was cracking now, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "For what? A failing ranch in the middle of nowhere? You'll be back in 6 months when reality sets in, when you remember that romantic notions don't pay rent or fund retirement accounts." The assumption that she'd come crawling back, that her dreams were so insubstantial they'd crumble under practical pressure, crystallized every doubt she'd been harboring about their relationship. "Maybe I will be back," she said quietly, standing and gathering her purse with movements that felt surprisingly steady. "But I'll never know what I'm capable of if I don't give myself the chance to find out." "And Ben? If the only way you can keep me is by convincing me I can't survive without you, then we were never really partners to begin with." She left the ring on his desk, where it caught the light from his banker's lamp and threw sharp-edged rainbows across legal documents that suddenly seemed completely irrelevant to anything that mattered. 24 hours later, Amaya was on a plane to Montana, staring out at clouds that looked impossibly white against endless blue sky. The 8-hour flight gave her plenty of time to question every decision she'd made in the past day, to wonder what qualified her to run a ranch she hadn't visited in years, to panic about walking away from everything she'd worked for since college. But underneath the doubt was something else, a flutter of anticipation she hadn't felt since law school, when every challenge had seemed like an adventure rather than an obstacle to be endured. For the first time in years, she had no idea what came next. For the first time in years, that felt like freedom rather than failure. The rental car felt foreign beneath her hands as she navigated roads that memory insisted should be familiar but looked different through adult eyes. The Teton Mountains rose in the distance exactly as she remembered, snow-capped peaks that had once seemed like the edge of the world and now felt like a beacon calling her toward something she'd forgotten was possible. The Double E Ranch spread out before her as she turned through the weathered wooden gate, and for a moment, time seemed to collapse entirely. The main house sat exactly where it always had, surrounded by cottonwood trees that had grown taller but no less welcoming. The barn looked recently painted, the fencing repaired and sturdy, the whole operation bearing the unmistakable signs of someone who'd been caring for Eleanor's legacy with extraordinary devotion. Someone had been taking remarkable care of the place she'd once called home. It was then that she heard it, the rhythmic sound of hooves against earth, the low murmur of a human voice speaking in tones meant to soothe rather than command. Amaya parked the rental car and followed the sound toward the main corral, her city heels sinking into dirt that smelled of hay and horses and honest work she'd forgotten existed. What she saw when she rounded the corner would change everything. Chapter 2. A man stood in the center of the corral, every line of his body focused on the magnificent black stallion that circled him with barely contained power. Even from a distance, even after 20 years, Amaya would have known him anywhere. Wyatt Boone had grown into his promise, taller, broader through the shoulders, moving with an unconscious grace that spoke of absolute comfort in his own skin and complete mastery of his environment. His dark hair curled slightly beneath his worn hat, shot through with silver at the temples that somehow made him more attractive rather than older. His face had been carved by years of sun and wind and responsibility into something that spoke of reliability, of strength, and of quiet competence that didn't need to announce itself to be recognized by everyone who mattered. The stallion was testing him, challenging his authority with every step, every toss of its magnificent head. But Wyatt moved with patient confidence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to calm both horse and observer. His hands were steady on the lead rope, his posture relaxed but alert, demonstrating an animal partnership that spoke of decades spent understanding the delicate balance between strength and gentleness. There was something mesmerizing about watching him work, something that made Amaya remember why she'd once thought he was the most compelling person she'd ever known. This wasn't just skill, this was artistry, a deep understanding that came from choosing to see the world through another creature's eyes. The horse chose that moment to rear, powerful hooves flashing in the afternoon sun, and Wyatt's response was so fluid it seemed choreographed. He stepped to the side with dancer-like grace, never breaking his rhythm, never raising his voice, simply waiting for the animal to realize that cooperation would bring better results than confrontation. It was then that he saw her. Their eyes met across the distance, and Amaya felt 20 years fall like a house of cards. Recognition flashed in his gaze, surprise, wonder, something that looked almost like relief, as if she were an answer to a prayer he'd stopped believing would be heard. The stallion, sensing his trainer's distraction, chose that moment to test the boundaries again. But if anything, Amaya's presence seemed to sharpen Wyatt's focus rather than diminish it, as if he wanted to prove something, to the horse, to himself, to her. Easy, he murmured, and she wasn't sure if he was talking to the stallion or himself. Easy now. Amaya approached the fence slowly, hyper-aware of how out of place she must look in her designer travel clothes and impractical shoes. But something about the way Wyatt was looking at her, like she belonged here despite the years and the distance and all the ways they'd both changed, made her feel more like herself than she had in longer than she could remember. "Hello, Wyatt," she said, her voice carrying across the corral with surprising steadiness. He removed his hat with one hand, never breaking his connection with the horse, and she saw that the years had been kind to him in the way they're kind to men who've lived honestly and worked with their hands. The boy she'd known had been attractive, the man he'd become was devastating in the most understated way possible. Amaya. Her name sounded different in his voice than it had in anyone else's, richer, like he'd been keeping it safe all these years, polishing it with memory until it gleamed. "I'm sorry about Eleanor." She meant everything to this place. To all of us. The simple words offered a comfort that formal condolences never could. This wasn't politeness, it was truth spoken by someone who'd loved Eleanor too, who understood exactly what the world had lost. "Thank you," she managed, though the words felt inadequate for the grief and gratitude and overwhelming sense of homecoming that was threatening to bring her to her knees. "I came to see what needs to be done. To understand what she left me." Something flickered across his expression, surprise, maybe, or hope quickly suppressed. Of course. Business. But it wasn't business, and they both knew it. Standing there with years of unspoken history between them, it felt like the most personal conversation she'd had in years. It felt like the beginning of something that had been interrupted long ago and was finally ready to resume. The stallion snorted impatiently, reminding them both that life had continued in their absence, that there were still things that needed tending, still work to be done. Wyatt's attention returned to his task, but Amaya could feel his awareness of her like a physical presence, could sense him cataloging every detail of her appearance, trying to reconcile the woman before him with the girl who'd left so long ago. "I should let you finish," she said, though she made no move toward the house. Something about this moment felt too important to abandon, too fragile to interrupt with practical concerns. "She always believed you'd come back," Wyatt said quietly, his attention seemingly focused on the horse but his words clearly meant for her. "Eleanor. She never stopped talking about the day you'd remember what this place meant to you." The words hit her like a revelation, bringing tears she hadn't expected to the surface. Eleanor had waited. Despite the years of sporadic phone calls and hurried holiday visits, despite Amaya's obvious immersion in a world that had nothing to do with ranching or family legacy, Eleanor had maintained faith that some connections run too deep to sever completely. Did she? Amaya's voice came out smaller than intended, thick with emotion she hadn't prepared for. Wyatt's eyes met hers again, and this time she saw something that made her pulse skip, not just recognition, but something deeper, more complex. Something that suggested her return meant more to him than mere professional obligation would explain. "Every day," he said simply, and the quiet certainty in his voice told her everything she needed to know about who had been caring for Eleanor's legacy with such obvious devotion. Before either of them could examine that revelation too closely, the sound of the front door opening interrupted the moment. A woman appeared on the porch, silver-haired and sturdy, moving with purposeful energy that suggested important business to attend to. "Amaya Wallace," the woman called out, her voice carrying a warmth that wrapped around the afternoon like a familiar embrace. "About time you came home." Mavis Tucker looked exactly as Amaya remembered, smaller than memory had painted her, but no less formidable, with eyes that missed nothing and a smile that had comforted 3 generations of children through scraped knees and broken hearts. Her silver hair was pulled back in its familiar bun, her apron already dusted with flour even though it was barely past noon. The reunion that followed was everything Amaya hadn't known she needed. Mavis's hug carried the scent of fresh bread and lavender soap, familiar as breathing, and for the first time since Sheriff Bradley's call, Amaya felt like she might actually survive the grief. "Let me look at you," Mavis said, holding her at arm's length with hands that remembered braiding her hair for county fair competitions. "All grown up and even more beautiful than your mother was at your age. Eleanor kept every picture you sent, you know. Talked about your cases like they were family victories." The mention of Eleanor brought fresh tears, but also something else, gratitude for a woman who'd seen potential in a confused teenager and never stopped believing in it, even when Amaya herself had forgotten it existed. "I should have come back sooner," Amaya whispered, voicing the guilt that had been clawing at her chest since the sheriff's call. "Should have, could have, would have," Mavis replied with a gentle firmness that had been cutting through emotional nonsense for decades. "Eleanor knew you loved her. She also knew you had to find your own way first. The important thing is you're here now, when it matters most." Over Mavis's shoulder, Amaya could see Wyatt finishing with the stallion, his movements efficient and practiced but somehow still graceful. Even focused on his work, she could feel his attention on their conversation, could sense him trying to understand what her presence here might mean beyond the practical business of inheritance. "Is he?" She started, then stopped, unsure how to ask about Wyatt without revealing too much about why the answer mattered. Still single? Still the finest man in 3 counties who's too stubborn to believe any woman could see past his humble beginnings to his true worth? Mavis's eyes twinkled with understanding that was both comforting and terrifying. Yes, honey. Some people are meant for waiting, even when they don't know what they're waiting for. The observation hit closer to home than Amaya was prepared for, suggesting depths to this situation that she wasn't ready to examine. But before she could formulate a response that wouldn't reveal too much, Wyatt approached the fence, leading the now calm stallion with quiet authority that spoke of years spent earning respect rather than demanding it. "Ladies," he said, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and utterly natural. "Beautiful afternoon for a homecoming." Up close, Amaya could see the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into sun and weather, could catch the scent of leather and horses and something uniquely him that brought back memories she'd thought were safely buried. He was even more attractive than her teenage heart had remembered, possessing an understated masculinity that had nothing to prove and everything to offer. "Wyatt," Mavis said with maternal authority, "why don't you show Amaya around the property while I get dinner started? She needs to see what Eleanor built here, needs to understand what she's inherited." It wasn't really a suggestion, and they all knew it. Mavis Tucker had been managing the emotional lives of everyone on the Double E Ranch for 4 decades, and she wasn't about to stop now just because the situation had become more complicated. The prospect of being alone with Wyatt, of trying to navigate their years of history and unfinished business, made Amaya's pulse race in ways that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with possibility. "I should change first," she said, gesturing to her impractical city clothes. "I brought some jeans, but I don't have proper boots." "Eleanor kept some of your old things," Mavis said gently. "In the closet in your old room. She couldn't bear to pack them away. Said you might need them someday." Amaya's throat tightened. 20 years of distance collapsed in an instant. Eleanor had been waiting, keeping faith when Amaya herself had forgotten what home meant. Inside the house, everything was exactly as she remembered, hardwood floors worn smooth by generations of honest work, walls covered with family photographs spanning decades, furniture chosen for comfort rather than appearance. But it was the pictures that stopped her cold. Images of ranch life from across the years, including several of her and Wyatt from those final summers before college. In one photograph, they were both mounted on horseback, grinning at the camera with unguarded joy that made her chest ache with recognition. In another, taken at some long-ago county fair, Wyatt's arm was around her shoulders, both of them dusty from competition and laughing at something outside the frame. They looked like young people who belonged together, who were building towards something that could last. She treasured those, Mavis said softly, following her gaze. Said they reminded her that some kinds of love are worth waiting for, even when you don't know if waiting will be enough. In Eleanor's bedroom, now hers, she supposed, though the thought felt surreal, Amaya found more than just clothing. She found journals documenting years of ranch life, photo albums filled with family history, and a letter addressed to her in Eleanor's careful handwriting. With hands that trembled slightly, she opened the envelope. "My dearest Amaya. If you're reading this, then I've gone to join your great-uncle Robert, and you've finally come home. I hope you won't be angry that I've left you with such a complicated inheritance, but I couldn't bear the thought of this land going to strangers who wouldn't understand what it could become. Wyatt has been more than an employee to me, he's been the family I never had, the one who's kept this place running with love and dedication even when the numbers didn't always add up. He has dreams for this ranch that would make your grandfather proud, visions that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture in this entire valley. But he needs a partner who understands both tradition and innovation, someone who can see the bigger picture while still appreciating the beauty of everyday miracles. I'm not asking you to abandon everything you've worked for. I'm asking you to consider that maybe everything you've been working toward has been preparing you for this moment, this choice, this chance to build something that matters on a scale larger than quarterly profits. Don't let fear make your decisions for you, darling. Some connections are worth more than all the security in the world, and some dreams are worth the risk of having your heart broken all over again. All my love, Eleanor. P.S. There's a folder in my desk containing Wyatt's business plans. You might be surprised by what that man has been dreaming about. By the time Amaya finished reading, tears were streaming down her face unchecked. Eleanor had seen straight through to the heart of things, to dreams Amaya had buried so deep she'd almost forgotten they existed. The letter was both permission and challenge, an invitation to consider possibilities that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She changed quickly into jeans that still fit perfectly and boots that remembered the shape of her feet, caught her reflection in Eleanor's antique mirror and saw someone she barely recognized. Without the armor of designer clothing and professional styling, she looked younger, softer, more like the girl who'd once believed she could accomplish anything if she just had enough courage to try. Wyatt was waiting by the barn when she emerged, and the appreciation that flashed across his features when he saw her was unmistakable. Better, he said simply, but the warmth in his voice suggested he meant more than just her choice of clothing. As they walked toward the main barn together, Amaya found herself hyper-aware of everything, the way Wyatt moved with unconscious grace, the scent of hay and leather and horses that seemed to awaken memories in her bones, the sky that seemed bigger here than anywhere else on earth. This was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Eleanor mentioned that you have plans for the ranch, Amaya said as they reached the main barn, her voice carefully neutral despite the way her pulse quickened at Wyatt's proximity. Development plans. Wyatt's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, hope and caution warring in his features. Those were just ideas. Dreams, really. Nothing concrete enough to trouble you with. Try me, she said, surprised by how much she wanted to hear his vision, how much his dreams had started to matter to her in the space of a single afternoon. For a moment, she thought he might deflect again, might retreat behind the careful professionalism he'd maintained since her arrival. But then something in her expression must have convinced him that her interest was genuine, because his shoulders relaxed slightly and his voice took on the tone of someone sharing something precious. Heritage breed conservation, he said, the words coming slowly at first, then gaining momentum as passion overcame caution. Sustainable tourism that educates rather than exploits. Educational partnerships with local schools to teach urban kids where their food actually comes from. The land could support a small-scale organic operation that supplies restaurants in Jackson and Bozeman, places that are desperate for locally sourced ingredients with verified sustainability practices. As he talked, his entire demeanor transformed. The careful reserve melted away, replaced by enthusiasm and intelligence and the kind of visionary thinking that Amaya recognized from her most successful clients. This wasn't just wishful thinking, this was comprehensive planning rooted in deep understanding of both land management and market forces. The main house could host workshops on sustainable living, he continued, gesturing toward spaces as if he could already see them filled with eager learners. Cooking classes featuring ingredients from our own gardens and livestock. Horseback riding experiences that teach proper animal husbandry alongside recreation. Real working ranch experiences for people who want to understand what it takes to raise food responsibly. They'd reached the main barn, and Wyatt pushed open the heavy wooden doors to reveal a space that was both functional and somehow beautiful. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars. The smell of hay and leather and honest work wrapped around them like an embrace. This is where Eleanor taught me to ride, Amaya said softly, running her hand along the worn wooden rail of an empty stall. I was probably 4 years old, insisting I was ready for a full-sized horse. I remember, Wyatt said, and something in his voice made her look up sharply. You were the most fearless person I'd ever met. Drove me absolutely crazy with the chances you'd take. Drove you crazy? She repeated, genuinely surprised. You always seemed so controlled. So composed. I assumed I was just the annoying city girl who showed up every summer and got in the way. Wyatt's laugh was rough around the edges, like he was out of practice with genuine amusement. Annoying? Christ, Amaya, I was terrified every minute you were here. You'd climb anything, ride anything, challenge anyone to keep up with you. I spent half my time trying to keep you from breaking your neck and the other half trying to convince myself I didn't care whether you noticed me doing it. The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that neither seemed ready to fully examine. Amaya felt her heart racing as she processed what he'd just revealed, that her presence had affected him, that he'd been paying attention, that the awareness she'd felt hadn't been one-sided after all. I noticed, she said quietly, the words carrying more weight than she'd intended. I always noticed. Before either of them could explore that revelation further, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the moment. A young man appeared in the barn doorway, leading a horse that was clearly favoring one leg, his expression carrying concern that suggested this wasn't a routine matter. Sorry to interrupt, boss, he said, touching his hat respectfully toward Amaya. But Thunder here stepped wrong coming in from the south pasture. Doesn't look too serious, but I thought you'd want to take a look before it gets worse. The easy respect in the young man's voice, the way he automatically deferred to Wyatt's expertise, told Amaya everything she needed to know about the kind of leader Wyatt had become. This wasn't just employment, this was family, built on mutual respect and genuine care. Javier Santos, Wyatt said by way of introduction, already moving to examine the horse's leg. Javier, this is Amaya Wallace, Eleanor's niece. She owns the ranch now. The young man's eyes widened slightly with something that might have been awe. Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss. Miss Eleanor was special to all of us. She gave me a chance when nobody else would, taught me that a man's past doesn't have to define his future. As Wyatt worked with gentle efficiency to assess the horse's injury, Amaya found herself studying the dynamics between the two men. There was obvious respect flowing both directions, a mentorship relationship that spoke to Wyatt's character as much as his competence. Nothing serious, Wyatt pronounced after a careful examination. Just a stone bruise. Keep him in the near pasture for a few days, and he'll be fine. Thanks, boss. And ma'am? Javier touched his hat again toward Amaya. Welcome home. We've all been hoping you'd come back someday. After Javier led the horse away, Amaya found herself alone with Wyatt again, their unspoken history settling between them like a physical presence. The afternoon light streaming through the barn windows had taken on the golden quality that marked the approach of evening, and she realized they'd been talking for hours without her noticing the passage of time. You've built something remarkable here, she said, genuinely impressed by what she'd witnessed. The way Javier looks up to you, the condition of the facilities, the vision you've developed, this isn't just a job for you, is it? Eleanor gave me more than employment, Wyatt said quietly. She gave me purpose, belonging, a chance to build something meaningful. I've tried to honor that gift by taking care of what she loved most. Including the people, Amaya observed, thinking about Javier's obvious gratitude and respect. Especially the people, Wyatt agreed. Eleanor had a gift for seeing potential in others, for giving second chances to folks who needed them most. I've tried to continue that tradition. They walked in comfortable silence toward the creek that marked the eastern boundary of the property, Wyatt pointing out improvements that had been made over the years, explaining the seasonal rhythms of ranch life, sharing stories about particular animals or memorable events. With each shared memory, each casual touch as he helped her over a fence or pointed out something in the distance, Amaya felt more of her carefully constructed city persona falling away. By the time they reached the creek, the sun was beginning to sink toward the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that no city sunset could match. This was where they'd always ended up during those long-ago summer evenings, the place where teenage conversations had ranged from profound to ridiculous, where she'd first started to understand that the ache in her chest when she looked at Wyatt wasn't just friendship. Remember the night you tried to convince me that city girls were tougher than ranch girls? Wyatt asked, settling onto the large boulder that had served as their unofficial meeting place. Amaya laughed, the sound lighter than it had been in months. I believe I proved my point by outfishing you 3 days running. You got lucky. I got skillful. There's a difference. They were teasing now, falling back into the easy banter that had once come as naturally as breathing. But underneath the surface lightness, Amaya could feel the quiet ache of everything left unsaid, unfinished threads from the day she left for college and he stayed behind to build a life on the land they both loved. Have you ever returned to a place from your childhood and felt like you were meeting a completely different version of yourself? Share in the comments how going back to your roots changed your perspective on what you really wanted in life. Why didn't you ever leave? She asked suddenly, the question tumbling out before she could stop it. You were smart enough to do anything, go anywhere. Why stay here? Wyatt was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held absolute honesty. Where else was I going to go? He said simply. This is where I belong. This land, these people, this life, it's all I ever wanted. Well, he paused, his eyes meeting hers across the fading light, almost all. The almost hung in the air between them like a challenge, like an invitation, like the beginning of a conversation they'd been avoiding for years. Amaya felt her breath catch, felt the familiar flutter of possibility in her chest that she'd thought she'd outgrown. Before she could find the courage to ask what he meant, the sound of Mavis ringing the dinner bell carried across the pasture, practical and insistent as always. The moment shattered like glass, leaving them both blinking in the sudden awareness of how close they'd been sitting, how intently they'd been looking at each other. We should get back, Wyatt said, standing and offering her his hand. Mavis doesn't appreciate being kept waiting. His hand was warm and calloused against hers, strong enough to pull her effortlessly to her feet but gentle enough that she could have pulled away at any moment. She didn't want to let go, wanted to ask him to finish what he'd been saying, wanted to bridge the gap between almost and everything. But courage, it seemed, was something she'd left behind along with her teenage dreams. As they walked back toward the house in the gathering twilight, Amaya found herself acutely aware of everything, the way the evening air carried the scent of wild roses and distant wood smoke, the sound of cattle settling for the night, the solid presence of the man walking beside her. The irony wasn't lost on her, she'd spent years climbing toward a summit that turned out to be the wrong mountain entirely. Dinner at the ranch house was exactly what she'd forgotten she missed. Honest food served around a table that had hosted 3 generations of conversations, laughter that echoed off walls worn smooth by decades of authentic living, and the comfortable chaos that comes from people who genuinely care about each other's well-being. Mavis had prepared a feast that spoke of comfort and celebration, pot roast that fell apart at the touch of a fork, fresh bread still warm from the oven, green beans from her own garden, and apple pie that made Amaya close her eyes in recognition of flavors from childhood. This tastes exactly like I remember, she said around a bite that transported her instantly back to summer evenings when the most complicated decision was whether to have seconds on dessert. Same recipe your great-grandmother used, Mavis said with satisfaction. Some things are worth preserving exactly as they were. Javier joined them for the meal, along with 2 other ranch hands. Marcus, a weathered man in his 50s who carried himself with the dignity of someone who'd earned respect through decades of honest work, and Tommy, barely out of high school but already showing dedication that spoke to Wyatt's mentoring skills. Tell us about New York, Tommy asked with the eager curiosity of someone who'd never been more than 100 miles from home. Is it really like in the movies? All those skyscrapers and millions of people? More people than you can imagine, Amaya confirmed with a smile that felt more natural than it had in years. And noise, constant noise. You forget how peaceful quiet actually sounds until you're somewhere like this. Don't you miss it? Marcus asked, his question carrying the weight of someone who understood that choices often involve leaving good things behind. The excitement, all those opportunities, being at the center of everything important? Amaya considered the question, surprised by how difficult it was to formulate an answer that felt honest. A week ago, she would have given an automatic defense of city life, the cultural opportunities, the professional challenges, the intoxicating sense of being part of something larger and more significant than individual concerns. But sitting here now, surrounded by conversation that felt real rather than calculated, watching people who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts rather than impressed by her credentials. She wasn't sure what she missed anymore. "Some things," she said finally. "But I'm discovering that some things you don't realize you're missing until you find them again." Across the table, Wyatt's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her pulse skip. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with the choices that define a life. After dinner, while Mavis efficiently organized the cleaning, Amaya found herself walking toward the porch with Wyatt, drawn by the promise of cooler air and conversation that seemed easier in the gathering darkness. They settled on the porch swing that had been her favorite spot during childhood summers, the familiar creak of chains and wood providing soundtrack to countless important conversations from her past. But sitting here now, hyper-aware of Wyatt's presence beside her, everything felt both familiar and completely new. "Can I ask you something?" Wyatt said, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching potentially dangerous territory. "Of course. What really happened in New York? What made you decide to walk away from everything you'd built there?" The question hit closer to home than she'd expected, requiring a level of honesty she wasn't sure she was prepared for. But something about the evening quiet, the man beside her, the sense of being in a place where pretense felt both impossible and unnecessary, made truth seem like the only reasonable option. "I realized I was living someone else's idea of success," she said slowly, choosing words carefully. "For years, I thought I wanted security, status, and a life that looks impressive from the outside. But I was just performing. Playing a role that never quite fit, trying to be the kind of woman who belonged in that world." "And now?" Wyatt asked quietly. "Now I'm wondering what I might be capable of if I stopped trying to fit into spaces that were never designed for me and started building something that actually matters." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, her admission settling between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. In the distance, she could hear the soft sounds of ranch life settling into evening rhythm, horses moving in their stalls, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through grass that stretched to the horizon. "Eleanor left me her journals," Amaya said eventually, pulling the worn leather book from her jacket pocket. "Her lifetime's worth of observations about this place, about the people who matter to her. About dreams she hoped someone would be brave enough to pursue." Wyatt's expression grew thoughtful as he recognized the journal, and she could see memory and affection warring with something that might have been apprehension. "She wrote about you," Amaya continued gently. "About the plans you've been developing, the vision you have for what this place could become. But also about other things. About waiting, and hope, and love that's worth building a life around." The admission hung in the air between them, and Amaya watched as understanding dawned in Wyatt's expression. For a moment, she thought he might retreat behind the careful professionalism he'd maintained all day, might deflect with humor or change the subject to safer ground. Instead, he leaned back against the swing, his eyes fixed on the stars that were beginning to appear in earnest now, and spoke with honesty that felt like a gift. "Eleanor saw things clearly," he said simply. "Sometimes more clearly than the people living them wanted to admit." "What did she see?" Amaya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Wyatt was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. He finally spoke. "She saw a man who'd been in love with the same woman for years, who'd convinced himself that wanting something that much meant he didn't deserve to have it. She saw a man who never could let go. Who kept this place running, hoping maybe you'd come back and we'd get another chance." The words hit Amaya like a revelation, confirming suspicions she'd been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. All these years, while she'd been trying to convince herself that her feelings had been one-sided infatuation, Wyatt had been carrying the same torch. "Wyatt," she began, but he held up a hand, clearly needing to finish what he'd started. "I'm not telling you this to pressure you or complicate your decisions about the ranch," he said firmly. "You've got enough to deal with without worrying about my feelings. But Eleanor believed in honesty, and she'd probably haunt this place forever if I let you leave again without knowing the truth. What truth? Amaya asked, though her heart was already racing with anticipation of his answer. That losing you the first time nearly broke me. That I've spent years trying to become the kind of man who might be worthy of someone like you. Everything I've done here, fixing fences, breeding programs, all of it, I kept thinking, what if she comes back? Kept hoping you'd see something worth staying for. The confession hung in the air between them like a challenge, like an invitation, like the beginning of a conversation that could change everything. Amaya felt tears prickling at her eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that the connection she'd thought was lost had been carefully preserved all these years by someone who'd never stopped believing in its value. You were always worthy, she said softly. I didn't leave because you weren't enough, Wyatt. I left because wanting you so much terrified me. Because loving someone that completely felt like giving up too much control, risking too much heartbreak. And now? He asked, echoing her earlier question back to her. Now I'm wondering what I might have missed by being so afraid of getting hurt that I never gave myself the chance to be happy. Before either of them could examine that revelation too closely, Amaya realized they'd been moving closer together on the swing, drawn by an invisible force that seemed to have its own gravity. Wyatt's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers intertwining in a perfect fit that spoke to connections deeper than conscious choice. Amaya, he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that made her breath catch. I need you to know something. I need you to understand what you mean to me, what this means to me. Tell me, she whispered, though her heart was already racing with the certainty that whatever he was about to say would change everything between them. I love you, he said simply, the words carrying careful restraint finally allowing itself to be heard. I've loved you since we were teens, and I'll love you until the day I die. But more than that, I respect you. I admire you. You're the strongest woman I know, Amaya. Smart, capable, brave. Can't believe I get to tell you that after all this time. The declaration hit her like a revelation, bringing tears to her eyes and a sense of completion to her heart that she'd never experienced before. This wasn't just romance or physical attraction or even the resolution of long-held feelings. This was recognition, two people seeing each other clearly and acknowledging the value of what they'd found. I love you too, she whispered, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. I love your strength and your kindness and your vision for what this place could become. I love the way you make me want to be braver, better, more than I ever thought I could be. The kiss that followed was inevitable, years of longing distilled into a single moment of perfect connection. It was soft and desperate and familiar all at once, like coming home and setting off on an adventure at the same time. It tasted like possibility and felt like the answer to questions she'd been asking her entire adult life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amaya rested her forehead against his and tried to find words for the sense of rightness that seemed to fill every cell of her body. I want to try, she said simply. I want to build something here with you. I want to see what we can create together. Wyatt's smile was like sunrise, full of wonder, gratitude and joy that comes from getting something you'd stopped believing was possible. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Because I meant what I said, I've been waiting for you for 20 years, and I'll wait 20 more if that's what it takes. No more waiting, Amaya said firmly, and sealed the promise with another kiss that tasted like home and felt like the beginning of everything she'd never known she wanted. Chapter 4. 3 weeks. That's how long it took for Amaya to understand that everything she'd thought she knew about love had been a pale imitation of the real thing. 3 weeks of working alongside Wyatt, learning the rhythms of ranch life, discovering that partnership could mean something entirely different from what she'd experienced in her previous relationships. During the days, they worked together with seamless efficiency that spoke to how naturally their skills complemented each other. Wyatt handled the physical demands of ranch management, the early morning feeding schedules, the equipment maintenance, the countless tasks that kept 40,000 acres running smoothly. Amaya tackled the business side with enthusiasm that surprised them both, using her legal expertise to navigate grant applications for the Heritage Breed program, researching sustainable tourism markets, and developing the regulatory frameworks that would allow them to implement Wyatt's vision safely and profitably. The Environmental Protection Agency has 3 different grant programs that our heritage breed conservation project could qualify for, she said one morning over coffee, spreading documents across the kitchen table that had become their unofficial business headquarters. If we can demonstrate measurable impact on soil health and water quality, we could secure enough funding to cover the first year's implementation costs. Wyatt looked up from the livestock health reports he'd been reviewing, and the admiration in his eyes made her pulse skip. "You've been researching this for 2 days. When did you even find time to sleep?" "Who needs sleep when you're building something that could revolutionize sustainable agriculture?" she said with a grin that felt more natural than any smile she'd worn in years. "Besides, I've spent 12 years drafting contracts for corporate mergers that shuffle money around without creating anything meaningful. This feels like actually using my skills for something that matters." It was true. Every regulation she navigated, every application she completed, every legal framework she developed felt like building rather than just processing. Instead of helping rich corporations get richer, she was creating pathways for innovation that could benefit entire communities while preserving the land that sustained them. The evenings were different, softer, more intimate, filled with conversations that had been impossible when they were teens but felt natural now that they'd both grown into themselves. They would sit on the porch swing as the sun set behind mountains that never lost their majesty, planning their future with an easy intimacy she'd never experienced with anyone else. "What do you think about offering cooking classes for couples?" Amaya asked one evening, curled against Wyatt's side in a way that felt both new and completely familiar. "Not just individual lessons, but weekend retreats where people can learn to prepare meals together using ingredients they've helped harvest." "I think it's brilliant," Wyatt said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I also think you're going to revolutionize how people think about food and where it comes from." These moments, when he talked about her ideas like they were treasure, still had the power to take her breath away. Ben had tolerated her professional ambitions as long as they didn't interfere with his own plans. Wyatt celebrated them, built on them, made them better through his own insights and experience. "I got a call from the county extension office today," he said, his arm tightening around her as evening air carried the scent of wild roses and distant wood smoke. "They want to feature our sustainable grazing program in their newsletter. Word spreading about what we're doing here." "Good," Amaya said, letting herself sink deeper into his warmth. "The more attention we can draw to these practices, the better. Plus, publicity like that will help with tourism marketing when we're ready to launch." They'd been having conversations like this for weeks now, a partnership planning that blended business strategy with domestic comfort in ways that felt revolutionary to someone who'd spent years compartmentalizing her life into separate, manageable pieces. But it was the physical aspect of their relationship that truly amazed her. After years with Ben, who'd approached intimacy like another item to check off his daily agenda, being with Wyatt felt like discovering that her body was capable of things she'd never imagined. Every touch carried meaning, every kiss built on the last, every shared glance across a crowded room sent heat racing through her system. They'd been careful with each other at first, both aware that they were building something too important to rush. But as days turned into weeks and trust deepened into something that felt unshakable, the physical connection between them had grown into something that left her breathless with its intensity. "There's something I need to tell you," Wyatt said one evening as they walked back from checking on the horses. The seriousness in his tone made her stop walking, made her turn to face him in the gathering dusk. "What is it?" she asked, though her heart was already racing with possibilities. "Javier's been asking about winter work," he said, and she could hear the deeper worry beneath the practical concern. "Whether we'll have enough to keep the full crew on through the slow season. These people, they're not just employees, Amaya. They're family. They've invested their lives in this place because Eleanor convinced them it would always be here for them." The responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to carry. She'd inherited more than land and buildings, she'd inherited the hopes and livelihoods of people who'd built their futures around the promise of stability and belonging. "We'll make it work," she said firmly, surprising herself with how natural the determination felt. "Even if it means I take on some contract legal work to bridge the gap until the new revenue streams are established. These people have been loyal to this place for years, we're not going to abandon them now." Wyatt's expression shifted into something that looked like wonder, and she realized she'd said, "weak," without even thinking about it. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks, she'd stopped thinking of herself as a temporary visitor and started thinking of herself as someone with a permanent stake in this place's future. He repeated softly, and the word sounded like a promise in his voice. She confirmed, rising on her toes to kiss him with all the certainty she felt about their partnership, their future, their ability to build something meaningful together. It happened on a Tuesday evening, after a day spent working together to repair a fence line damaged by the previous winter's storms. They'd been at it since dawn, working in comfortable partnership, Wyatt handling the heavy lifting while Amaya managed the precise measurements and legal documentation needed for the property line verification. By the time they finished, both were exhausted, dusty, and completely satisfied with what they'd accomplished. The fence was stronger than it had been before the damage, the property lines were properly documented, and they'd proven to themselves that they could handle whatever challenges ranch life threw at them. "I never realized how satisfying physical work could be," Amaya said as they walked back toward the house, her muscles pleasantly tired in ways that sitting behind a desk for 12 hours had never achieved. "Actually seeing something you've built with your own hands, knowing it will still be there protecting what matters years from now. That's the best part of ranch life," Wyatt agreed, holding open the gate that led to the main yard. "Every day, you can see the results of your work. Every improvement makes everything better for everyone who depends on this place." They were both filthy, dirt under their fingernails, sweat staining their shirts, hay in their hair from crawling under fence lines. Amaya would have once been horrified to be seen in such a state. But here, with Wyatt, she felt more beautiful than she ever had in designer gowns and flawless makeup. "I should shower," she said as they reached the porch, suddenly hyper-aware of how close they were standing, how the evening light caught the silver in his hair and made his eyes look even bluer. "So should I," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "But Amaya." "Yes?" "I don't want to pretend anymore, Amaya. This isn't just business. Hasn't been since you came home." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with invitation and possibility, and that made her heart race with anticipation. "Then don't," she said simply, reaching for his hand. "Come with me." The shower they shared was an exercise in sweet torture, hands that had been careful becoming bold, touches that had been hesitant becoming confident, the exploration of what it meant to be completely vulnerable with someone who saw that vulnerability as a gift rather than a weakness. Under the warm spray of water, as steam fogged the bathroom mirror and calloused hands traced the knots in her shoulders, Amaya discovered that trust could be its own form of intimacy, deeper than desire, more lasting than passion. Every touch was a revelation, every kiss a promise of what they could build together. Later, lying tangled together in the bed that had been Eleanor's, surrounded by the scent of lavender sachets and family history, they discovered what it meant to make love rather than simply have sex. This wasn't performance or obligation or even just desire, this was connection, recognition, two people choosing each other completely and without reservation. "I love you," Wyatt whispered against her hair as she traced patterns on his chest, marveling at how perfectly her body fit against his. "Been loving you so long, I forgot there was supposed to be anything else." "I love you too," she whispered back, the words feeling both momentous and completely natural. "I love your strength and your patience and your vision for what this place could become. I love the way you make me want to be braver than I've ever been." They made love again as the sun rose, slower this time, savoring each touch and kiss and whispered endearment. In the golden light of morning, with Montana spreading out beyond the windows like a promise of endless possibility, Amaya finally understood what Eleanor had seen, what she'd hoped for, what she'd been patient enough to wait for. This wasn't just about love or physical attraction or even shared business goals. This was about coming home to herself, to the person she'd always been underneath all the professional masks and social expectations. This was about building something that would matter long after quarterly reports were forgotten and partnership announcements had faded into irrelevance. "The community rodeo is next weekend," Wyatt said over breakfast, his fingers intertwined with hers across the kitchen table that had witnessed so many important conversations. "I was thinking, if you wanted to go together. Officially." There was something in his voice that suggested this was about more than just a date night, and Amaya felt her pulse skip with anticipation of whatever tradition or significance she was missing. "Are you asking me to go steady, Mr. Boone?" she teased, though she could hear the deeper question underneath his words. "I'm asking if you're ready to let everyone know that this is real," he said honestly. "That we're building something together, that you're not just here temporarily. That you're home to stay." The word home settled into her chest like a warm glow. Home hadn't been a place for her in so long, it had been achievements and acquisitions and the constant effort to prove she belonged in spaces that never quite felt right. But here, with Wyatt, planning their future together, home felt like the most natural thing in the world. "I'm ready," she said firmly. "I want everyone to know." What she didn't understand yet was exactly how significant that public declaration would become, or how perfectly it would set the stage for challenges that would test everything they'd built together. The morning brought news that made both their professional partnership and personal relationship feel more urgent, more precious, more worth fighting for. Dr. Callie Sutton arrived early with documentation that the first group of heritage breed cattle were ready for transport, that their sustainable grazing program had been approved for state funding, that everything they'd been working toward was finally becoming reality. "This is remarkable," Dr. Sutton said, reviewing the legal frameworks Amaya had developed for the educational tourism component. "I've never seen such comprehensive planning for this kind of innovative agriculture program. You've thought of everything: liability coverage, environmental impact protocols, educational certification requirements. That's what happens when you combine vision with expertise," Amaya said, glancing at Wyatt with a pride that had nothing to do with professional achievement and everything to do with what they'd accomplished together. But it was later that afternoon, when Javier approached them with an expression that mixed excitement with concern, that they realized their success was beginning to attract attention that could be dangerous. "Boss," he said, touching his hat respectfully, "there's been a woman asking questions around town. About the ranch, about your plans, about whether the property might be for sale. She's been offering to buy people drinks in exchange for information about what you're doing here." Wyatt's expression hardened into something Amaya had never seen before. "What kind of woman?" "City type," Javier said carefully. "Expensive clothes and fancy car. She left a business card at Henderson's store, asked them to give it to you if you were interested in discussing mutually beneficial opportunities. Savannah Rhodes." Even without seeing the business card, Amaya knew exactly who had been asking questions. The development company that had been circling Eleanor like a vulture for years, waiting for the old woman to die so they could swoop in and transform 40,000 acres of working ranch land into subdivisions and shopping centers. "She doesn't know yet," Amaya said, thinking quickly. "About us, about our plans, about the fact that the ranch isn't going anywhere. She's still operating under the assumption that I'm a grief-stricken city lawyer who'll be eager to unload an unwanted inheritance." "What do you want to do?" Wyatt asked, and the way he phrased the question, as if her decision would be their decision, as if they were truly partners in every sense of the word, made her fall in love with him all over again. "We stick to our plan," she said firmly. "We go to the rodeo, we make our relationship public, we show this entire community that the Double E Ranch has a future they can count on. And if Ms. Rhodes wants a fight, we give her one she'll never forget." The determination in her voice surprised them both, but it felt right, felt strong, felt like the woman she'd always been underneath all the careful politeness and professional restraint. "Together?" Wyatt asked, echoing the word that had become their touchstone. "Together," she confirmed, and sealed the promise with a kiss that tasted like determination and felt like the beginning of the most important battle of their lives. Sometimes the biggest obstacles to love come from our own fears rather than outside forces. Tell us about a time when you had to choose between playing it safe and taking a leap of faith for love. Chapter 5. The morning of the community rodeo dawned clear and bright, with a crystalline sky that made everything seem possible. Amaya stood before Eleanor's antique mirror, adjusting the simple blouse she'd chosen to go with jeans that had become as comfortable as her suits had once been. She wanted to look like she belonged, to be seen as someone who'd chosen this community rather than someone playing dress-up for a weekend adventure. "You look perfect," Wyatt said from the doorway, his voice carrying warmth that made her pulse skip even after weeks of hearing it every morning. He was dressed in his competition clothes, crisp shirt, pressed jeans, boots polished to a shine, and the sight of him took her breath away all over again. "Are you nervous?" she asked, though she wasn't sure if she was talking about his bronc riding competition or the public statement they were about to make about their relationship. "About riding?" "No." His eyes met hers in the mirror, and she saw something that made her heart race. "About claiming you in front of the entire valley?" Terrified and exhilarated in equal measure. The word, claiming, sent shivers down her spine, carrying implications that went far beyond simple relationship announcements. In ranch culture, she was beginning to understand, some gestures carried weight that legal documents and engagement announcements never could. The rodeo grounds were exactly as she remembered from childhood, a dusty arena surrounded by bleachers that had been built by community volunteers decades ago, food stands operated by local families, ABD authentic Americana that tourists paid premium prices to experience. But being here as an adult, as part of a couple that everyone would be watching and evaluating, gave everything new significance. "Wyatt Boone," called out a familiar voice, and Amaya turned to see Martha Henderson approaching with a purposeful stride that suggested important news to share. "About time you brought this young lady to a proper community gathering. Amaya, honey, you look like you were born to ranch life." The casual acceptance, the assumption that she belonged here, made Amaya's throat tight with emotion. After years of feeling like an outsider despite all her professional success, being embraced by an entire community felt like a gift she hadn't realized she needed. "Eleanor always said she'd be back," Martha continued with satisfaction. "Said this land was in her blood whether she knew it or not. And looking at you two together, I can see she was right about more than just the ranch." As more people approached, ranchers and their families, local business owners, young youths who'd grown up hearing stories about Eleanor's lawyer niece who'd made good in the big city, Amaya found herself explaining their vision for the ranch over and over again. But instead of feeling like she was defending her choices, it felt like sharing good news with people who had a genuine stake in her success. "Sustainable tourism, you say?" asked Tom Bradley, a weathered rancher whose family had been in the valley for 4 generations. "Sounds like fancy talk for turning working land into a playground for city folks." "Actually," Amaya said, recognizing the challenge in his tone and meeting it head-on, "it's about education and preservation. Teaching urban families where their food comes from, how proper land management actually improves soil health, why traditional ranching skills matter for environmental sustainability. We're not changing what this land does. We're helping people understand why what it does matters." The explanation, delivered with confidence and genuine passion, seemed to satisfy even the skeptics. Amaya could see respect growing in eyes that had been prepared to dismiss her as another city lawyer with more money than sense. "Well," Tom said finally, extending a calloused hand for her to shake, "if you can make traditional ranching profitable in today's market while keeping developers like that Rhodes woman at bay, you've got my support." The mention of Savannah Road sent murmurs through the gathered crowd, and Amaya realized that the entire community was aware of the threat the development company posed to their way of life. This wasn't just about the Double E Ranch, it was about preserving an entire culture that valued land stewardship over quick profits. "The Double E isn't going anywhere," she said firmly, her voice carrying across the crowd. "This ranch has been home to my family for 4 generations, and it's going to stay home for 4 more. The declaration was met with nods of approval and scattered applause, but it was the way Wyatt was looking at her, with pride and admiration that made her feel like she could take on the world. The afternoon passed in a blur of competitions and conversations, barbecue that tasted like childhood memories, and the comfortable rhythm of community celebration. But it was when the announcer called for bronc riding competitors that Amaya understood why this day mattered so much to Wyatt. "You're really doing this?" she asked as he retrieved his competition gear from the truck, though the answer was obvious from the way other riders were greeting him with respect reserved for serious competitors. "Every year since I was 18, he confirmed, checking his equipment with the methodical precision of someone who understood that small details could mean the difference between victory and injury. "It's tradition, but it's also proof, I guess. That I belong here, that I've earned my place in this community." Watching Wyatt prepare for his ride, seeing him interact with the other competitors with easy camaraderie, Amaya realized she was witnessing something that went far beyond athletic competition. This was about proving himself worthy of respect in a community that valued skill and courage above everything else, about maintaining his position in a social structure that had accepted him as family despite his orphaned origins. "He's the one to beat," said a voice behind her, and Amaya turned to see a young cowboy adjusting his own gear. "Wyatt's taken first place 4 of the last 6 years. Best seat and steadiest hands in the state, some say." The pride in the young man's voice, the obvious respect for Wyatt's abilities, made Amaya realize she was about to see a side of the man she loved that she'd never witnessed before, not just the patient ranch manager or visionary businessman, but the skilled athlete who commanded respect through pure ability. When Wyatt's name was called, Amaya positioned herself at the fence with the other spectators, her heart hammering with a combination of excitement and terror. She'd seen him work with horses countless times, knew he was skilled and experienced, but bronc riding was different, wilder, more dangerous, less predictable. The gate opened and chaos erupted. The horse that burst into the arena was magnificent and furious, a powerful brown stallion that seemed determined to prove no human could master him. But Wyatt moved with the animal's rhythm rather than fighting against it, his body flowing with each violent buck and twist like he was part of the horse itself. 8 seconds had never felt so long. Amaya found herself holding her breath, her hands gripping the fence rail as she watched Wyatt demonstrate a skill that came from a lifetime of understanding horses and balance and the split-second timing that separated champions from casualties. When the buzzer sounded and Wyatt dismounted cleanly, landing on his feet with the grace of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, the crowd erupted in appreciation. The score, when it was announced, confirmed what everyone already knew: this wasn't just a good ride, it was a winning ride. But instead of heading toward the competitors' area to celebrate with the other riders, Wyatt walked directly toward her section of the fence. The crowd seemed to sense that something significant was happening, conversations dying away as people turned to watch. Amaya felt dozens of eyes tracking her movement as she made her way through the spectators and over the fence, hyper-aware that whatever was about to happen was being witnessed by the entire community. When she reached Wyatt, he was holding his hat in both hands, dust from the arena still streaking his face, but his eyes were serious and intent despite the adrenaline that must still be coursing through his system. "Amaya Wallace," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet, "there's something I need to do." Before she could ask what he meant, Wyatt was placing his hat on her head with reverent ceremony. The worn felt settled over her hair like a crown, and the roar of approval from the crowd told her that she just participated in something far more significant than a simple gesture. The hat on her head felt like a promise, like a public declaration that she was exactly where she belonged. But it was the look in Wyatt's eyes that made her understand the full significance of what had just happened. In front of his entire community, the people whose respect mattered more to him than anything else in the world, he just announced that she was his partner, his equal, his chosen future. The crowd was cheering now, but all Amaya could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. This wasn't just about love or attraction or even partnership, this was about belonging, about being claimed by someone who saw her worth and wasn't afraid to declare it publicly. "I love you," she said, not caring who heard, standing on her toes to kiss him in front of God and everyone. The kiss was met with cheers and applause that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves, but Amaya barely heard it. All her attention was focused on the man in her arms, the life they were building together, the community that had just welcomed her home with open hearts. When they finally broke apart, both laughing with the joy of the moment, Amaya became aware that the celebration around them had taken on a different quality. People were approaching with congratulations that felt like benedictions, older women offering advice about marriage and ranching, younger couples asking about their plans for the future. "About time," said a gruff voice, and Amaya turned to see Sheriff Jesse Bradley approaching with a grin that transformed his usually serious face. "Eleanor always said you two were meant for each other. Just took you both long enough to figure it out." "Some things are worth waiting for," Wyatt said, his arm tightening around Amaya's waist in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Well, you won't have to wait much longer for trouble," the sheriff said, his expression growing more serious. "That Rhodes woman has been making noise about environmental concerns on your property. Nothing official yet, but she's been asking a lot of questions about water rights and soil testing permits." The warning hit Amaya like cold water, reminding her that their happiness was built on land that others coveted, that their future together depended on their ability to protect what Eleanor had entrusted to them. "Let her come," Amaya said, Wyatt's hat still sitting on her head like a symbol of everything she was now prepared to fight for. "We're not going anywhere." The determination in her voice surprised everyone, including herself. But wearing Wyatt's hat, surrounded by a community that had just claimed her as one of their own, she felt capable of taking on any challenge that dared to threaten what they'd built together. As evening settled over the rodeo grounds and the competition gave way to celebration, a local band set up on a makeshift stage and families began clearing space for dancing. The atmosphere shifted from the excitement of competition to the warm intimacy of community fellowship, and Amaya found herself swept into conversations and introductions that felt like formal adoption into a family she'd never known she belonged to. "May I have this dance?" Wyatt asked as the band struck up their first song, a classic country ballad that spoke of simple pleasures and enduring love. Amaya looked around at the couples already swaying together under strings of lights that had been hung between the arena posts, at children running between the dancers with the freedom that only comes from being absolutely safe and absolutely loved, at the faces of people who'd spent their entire lives building something meaningful together. "I'd be honored," she said, taking his hand and letting him lead her onto the dusty arena floor that had been transformed into a dance floor by nothing more than community will and shared joy. Dancing with Wyatt felt like coming home and setting off on an adventure at the same time. He moved with the same unconscious grace she'd admired in everything he did, leading her through simple steps that somehow felt like the most complex choreography she'd ever learned. Other couples spun around them, but all her attention was focused on the man holding her, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and impossible and finally real. "No regrets?" he asked quietly as they swayed to music that spoke of roots and love that grows stronger with time. "Only that it took me so long to come home," she said honestly, looking up at the man who'd waited for her with such patient faith. "But maybe we both needed time to become the people who could make this work." "Maybe," he agreed, then added with certainty that made her heart race, "but now that you're here, now that everyone knows you belong here, I'm never letting you go." The words carried the promise and possession of a man who'd waited long enough and was finally ready to claim his happiness completely. Around them, the community that had raised them both continued to celebrate, but all Amaya could focus on was the future they were building together, the legacy they would create, the love that had survived the years of separation and was finally free to flourish. "Good," she whispered against his lips before kissing him under the stars, his hat still on her head like a crown that declared her exactly where she belonged. "Because I'm not going anywhere." The promise felt like the most natural thing in the world, like something she'd been building toward her entire life without knowing it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that some connections are strong enough to overcome any obstacle. But tonight, dancing under stars that seemed brighter than any city sky, wearing the hat of the man who'd never stopped believing in the power of home, Amaya finally understood what Eleanor had seen, what she'd hoped for, what she'd been patient enough to wait for. This wasn't just about love or partnership or even shared dreams. This was about becoming the person she'd always been meant to be, in the place she'd always been meant to call home, with the person who'd always been worth waiting for. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their children and folding up their chairs, Amaya and Wyatt lingered on the dance floor, reluctant to let the magic of this day fade into memory. They'd made their choice public, claimed their future in front of witnesses who mattered, and tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight, with his hat on her head and his arms around her and the stars spreading out above them like blessings, anything felt possible. Chapter 6. 3 days after the rodeo, Amaya was in the ranch office reviewing educational partnership proposals when Javier burst through the door with an expression that mixed alarm with barely controlled anger. "Boss, you need to see this," he said, holding out a thick manila envelope that looked official and ominous. "Some men in suits were here this morning, said they were from the environmental agency. They left this for you, said it was urgent." Amaya's legal instincts immediately went on high alert. Environmental agencies didn't typically send unannounced representatives with urgent documents unless something was seriously wrong, or unless someone was trying to make it appear that something was wrong. "What kind of men?" she asked, already reaching for the envelope while her mind raced through possibilities. "The expensive kind," Javier said grimly. "City clothes, fancy car. They asked a lot of questions about our water sources, soil conditions, livestock health records." Amaya tore open the envelope and found exactly what she'd feared: environmental contamination reports claiming to show serious groundwater pollution on the southern boundary of the ranch. The documentation was thorough, professional-looking, and completely devastating if legitimate. But as she scanned the papers with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years reviewing complex legal documents, red flags began appearing everywhere. The testing timeline was impossibly compressed, the chain of custody documentation was too perfect, and the supposed contamination was located in exactly the area where development would be most profitable. "Wyatt," she called out, her voice carrying urgency that brought him running from the barn where he'd been working with the new heritage cattle. "What is it?" he asked, taking in her expression and immediately shifting into the protective mode she'd seen whenever anything threatened the ranch or its people. "Someone's trying to manufacture a crisis," she said, spreading the documents across the desk. "Look at this. Environmental contamination reports dated last week, claiming serious groundwater pollution that would require immediate remediation and potentially force U.S. to cease operations." Wyatt studied the papers, his jaw tightening as he processed what they were seeing. "This is impossible. I know every inch of this land, every water source, every drainage pattern. There's no contamination, I'd stake my life on it." "You won't have to," Amaya said grimly, already reaching for her phone. "Because whoever put this together made some serious mistakes. Environmental testing of this scope requires permits that take weeks to obtain, coordinated sampling that involves multiple agencies, and laboratory analysis that takes time. You can't arrange comprehensive soil and water testing, get lab results, and produce legal documentation in less than a week." She was already dialing as she spoke, calling contacts she'd made during years of environmental law practice. "Yes, this is Amaya Wallace calling for Director Harrison. It's urgent regarding unauthorized environmental testing in Teton County, Montana." While she worked the phones, Wyatt gathered the ranch hands to discuss security measures and review their own environmental monitoring records. The EE had been exceeding environmental standards for decades, but proving that to hostile investigators would require documentation and expertise that most ranches didn't maintain. "This is about more than just our ranch," Wyatt said grimly as they reconvened in the office an hour later. "If they can manufacture environmental crises to force land sales, they can target anyone in the valley who won't sell voluntarily." Amaya nodded, her conversation with the EPA having confirmed her worst suspicions. "The testing company on these reports doesn't exist. The permits they claim to have were never issued. And the lab that supposedly analyzed these samples has no record of receiving any materials from our property. So it's all fake?" Javier asked, relief evident in his voice. Completely fabricated, Amaya confirmed. Which means whoever's behind this has committed several federal crimes, falsifying environmental reports, fraud, conspiracy, criminal intimidation. The kind of charges that carry serious prison time. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles made them all turn toward the windows. A convoy of expensive cars was making its way up the ranch road, moving with aggressive purpose that suggested this wasn't a social call. "Showtime," Amaya said grimly, recognizing the lead vehicle. Savannah Rhodes is about to discover that she picked the wrong ranch and the wrong lawyer to mess with. Savannah Rhodes emerged from her black SUV like a general preparing for battle, her usual polished appearance sharpened into something predatory. She was followed by what appeared to be a full legal team, 3 men in expensive suits who looked like they'd been chosen for intimidation value rather than legal expertise, and a woman whose bearing suggested recent law school graduation and eagerness to prove herself. "Ms. Wallace," Savannah called out as she approached the main house, her voice carrying false sympathy designed to sound concerned rather than threatening. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but I'm afraid there's been a serious development regarding your property that requires immediate attention." Amaya stepped onto the porch with Wyatt at her side, his hat still sitting on her head from their morning ride, a visible symbol of belonging that no outside force could challenge. Behind them, she could sense rather than see the ranch hands positioning themselves strategically, ready to support whatever action became necessary. "A mess." "Rhodes," Amaya said coolly, her voice carrying icy authority that had once made opposing counsel nervous in conference rooms. "I wasn't expecting a social call. Especially not one that requires such an impressive entourage." "I'm afraid this isn't social," Savannah replied, her manicured fingers holding a manila envelope. "You know, Eleanor and I had several conversations about the challenges of maintaining a property this size. The testing requirements alone, soil, water, chemical runoff from decades of ranching. It's overwhelming for anyone, especially someone grieving. I'm here because I believe we can help each other." She stretched her hand out and producing the same manila envelope that had been delivered earlier, "I have some very disturbing information about environmental contamination on your property. Information that poses serious health risks not just to your operation but to the entire valley." The woman from the legal team stepped forward, introducing herself with a confidence that suggested she was trying a little too hard. "Ms. Wallace, I'm Janet Morrison, Environmental Counsel for Rhodes Development. These documents show significant groundwater contamination that will require immediate, expensive remediation." "Interesting," Amaya said thoughtfully, not moving to accept the documents. "Because I've been reviewing those same reports for the past hour, and I have some questions about their authenticity." She could see surprise flicker across Savannah's features, quickly replaced by calculated concern. "I understand this must be overwhelming, but time is critical. The State Environmental Agency will be notified tomorrow morning, and once that happens, your property will be subject to immediate restrictions and potential seizure." "Will they?" Amaya asked pleasantly, pulling out her phone with deliberate casualness. "Because I just got off the phone with Director Harrison at the EPA regional office, and he had some very interesting things to say about these reports." The blood drained from Janet Morrison's face as she realized exactly what kind of legal expertise she was facing. This wasn't a grief-stricken city lawyer who could be easily manipulated, this was someone who knew exactly how environmental law worked and had the contacts to verify every claim. "Those documents are completely legitimate," Janet started, but Amaya cut her off with a smile that had absolutely no warmth in it. "Are they? Because the testing company listed on these reports doesn't exist. The permits you claim to have were never issued by any government agency. And the laboratory that supposedly analyzed these samples has no record of receiving any materials from the Double Ranch." The silence that followed was loaded with the sudden understanding that the balance of power had shifted dramatically. Around them, she could sense the community that had attended the rodeo beginning to gather, neighbors who'd heard about the confrontation and come to support one of their own. "Furthermore," Amaya continued, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, Unauthorized environmental testing on private property without owner consent constitutes trespassing at minimum, and potentially criminal activity depending on what methods were used. She stepped closer to Savannah, her expression calm but unmistakably sharp, the same controlled fury that had dismantled opponents with far more resources. "Tell me, Ms. Rhodes, how exactly did your people gain access to my property to conduct soil and water sampling without my knowledge or permission?" The question hit exactly where she'd intended it to. Environmental testing required either explicit property owner consent or specific court orders, neither of which could have been obtained legally. "We had reason to believe there might be contamination issues affecting public health," Savannah tried, but Amaya was done playing defense. "You had reason to believe you could manufacture a crisis that would force me to sell at below market prices," she corrected sharply. "What you didn't count on was dealing with someone who spent years litigating environmental cases and has the professional contacts to expose fraudulent manipulation within hours rather than weeks." By now, the crowd had grown to include most of the community that had been at the rodeo, people who just claimed Amaya as one of their own and weren't about to let outsiders threaten her with impunity. Martha Henderson stood at the front of the group, her weathered face set in lines of absolute determination. "Let me be very clear about something," Amaya said, her voice carrying to every person present. "This ranch is not for sale. Not to you, not to anyone, not under any circumstances. If I discover that you've trespassed on my property, falsified environmental reports, or engaged in any other illegal activities in pursuit of this land, I will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law." The threat was delivered with quiet certainty. She let her gaze sweep across Savannah's entire team, making sure each of them understood the personal legal jeopardy they were now facing. "Furthermore," she continued, "I'll be filing complaints with the State Bar Association regarding Ms. Morrison's conduct today, requesting full investigations into your company's business practices, and forwarding all evidence of fraud to the appropriate federal authorities." Janet Morrison had gone white as paper, clearly understanding that her legal career was now at serious risk. Savannah's expression had shifted from predatory confidence to damage control mode, trying to calculate how to retreat without admitting guilt. "I think there's been a serious misunderstanding." Savannah tried again, but Wyatt stepped forward with the quiet authority that had kept the ranch running smoothly for over 2 decades. "No misunderstanding," he said firmly, his voice carrying the backing of every person in the crowd. "You came onto our property with false documents and criminal threats, trying to destroy something good because you couldn't acquire it honestly." The word "our" resonated through the crowd like a declaration, and Amaya felt a rush of warmth at how naturally he'd claimed their partnership in front of everyone who mattered. "You have exactly 10 minutes to get off this property," Wyatt continued with a calm that suggested he was perfectly capable of enforcing the deadline with community support. "After that, Sheriff Bradley and I will be discussing trespassing charges, fraud investigations, and whatever other legal remedies Amaya thinks are appropriate." The mention of local law enforcement clearly struck home. Rural sheriffs weren't impressed by expensive lawyers and development company intimidation tactics, especially when dealing with established community members and respected local families. As if summoned by the reference, Sheriff Bradley's patrol car appeared at the head of the ranch road, moving with the unhurried authority of someone who'd been expecting this confrontation and was prepared to handle it properly. "Looks like the cavalry's arrived," Martha Henderson called out with obvious satisfaction. "Jesse's been waiting for an excuse to have a conversation with those Rhodes people about their business practices." Savannah and her team retreated to their vehicles with as much dignity as they could manage, but the damage was done. They'd revealed the desperation behind their polished facade, demonstrated their willingness to use illegal tactics, and discovered that their intended victims were far more formidable than anticipated. As the expensive cars disappeared down the country road, trailing dust and wounded pride, the crowd erupted in cheers and applause that had nothing to do with rodeo competition and everything to do with community solidarity. "Now that," Sheriff Bradley said as he approached the porch, "is exactly how you handle threats to our way of life. Though I suspect this isn't over yet." "Let them come back," Amaya said, Wyatt's hat still on her head like a crown that declared her exactly where she belonged. We'll be ready. But even as she spoke with confidence, she knew the sheriff was right. Savannah Rhodes and her development company had too much money invested in acquiring Valley land to give up after one defeat. This was just the beginning of a longer war, one that would test everything she and Wyatt had built together. That evening, as they sat on the porch reviewing the day's events and planning their legal strategy, the sound of another approaching vehicle made them both tense. But this time, it was a single car, a familiar black Mercedes that made Amaya's stomach drop with recognition. "Ben," she said under her breath, watching her former fiancé step out of the driver's seat, every inch the polished, successful attorney, even after the long drive and the dust of the ranch. "The ex-fiancé?" Wyatt asked, and there was something in his voice that made her look at him sharply. "He shouldn't be here," she said, standing as Ben approached the porch with the confident stride of someone who'd never been denied anything he really wanted. "We're done. There's nothing left to discuss." "Amaya," Ben called out as he climbed the porch steps, his eyes briefly scanning Wyatt with the practiced assessment of a lawyer cataloging evidence. "Thank God I found you. Do you have any idea how worried I've been?" "Worried about what?" she asked coolly, making no move to invite him into the house or offer any of the courtesies she would have extended to a welcome guest. "About you throwing your life away on some romantic fantasy," Ben said, his voice carrying the patronizing patience that had once made her feel small and now just made her angry. "Darling, I understand you're grieving, but running away to this place isn't going to solve your problems." "What problems?" Amaya asked, genuinely confused. "I'm happier than I've been in years. I'm building something meaningful with someone who actually sees me as an equal partner. I'm finally living my life instead of performing someone else's version of it." Ben's expression shifted to that indulgent smile he reserved for moments he deemed her especially naive. "You're playing house on a failing ranch with a cowboy who'll never be able to give you the life you deserve. When reality sets in, and it will, you'll remember exactly what you walked away from." The casual dismissal of everything she'd built here, the assumption that Wyatt wasn't worthy of consideration as a serious partner, the complete failure to understand that she'd chosen this life rather than settled for it, all of it crystallized into focused anger that had once made opposing counsel reconsider their litigation strategies. "You know what I walked away from, Ben," she said. "I walked away from a man who thought my professional achievements were charming hobbies rather than serious accomplishments. I walked away from a relationship where I was expected to be grateful for scraps of respect instead of demanding the full partnership I deserved." Ben's confident facade was starting to crack, revealing the cold calculation beneath his polished exterior. "That's not fair, Amaya. I always supported your career. You tolerated my career as long as it didn't threaten your position as the more successful partner," she corrected sharply. "But you know what the real difference is between you and Wyatt?" She moved closer to Wyatt as she spoke, taking his hand with natural ease that spoke to connections deeper than conscious choice. "Wyatt spent years building something meaningful while waiting for the right partner to help him make it extraordinary. You spent 6 years trying to shape me into a woman who'd make you look good at galas and fundraisers. He sees my strength as something to celebrate while you saw it as something to manage." The kiss she gave Wyatt then was about more than just love or attraction, it was a declaration, a choice made public, a statement that some connections are worth more than all the security in the world. When they broke apart, Ben was staring at them with a shocked disbelief that comes from having your worldview completely overturned. "This is insane," he said finally, his voice pitched higher than usual with wounded pride and genuine confusion. "You're throwing away everything we built together for what? A fantasy about rural life that'll fall apart the moment you realize you can't run a ranch from Manhattan?" "I'm not running it from Manhattan," Amaya said calmly. "I'm running it from here. Because this is where I belong, with someone who wants to build dreams together instead of asking me to fit into his existing plans." "You'll be back," Ben said, but there was desperation in his voice now rather than confidence. "When the novelty wears off and you remember that romantic notions don't pay bills or fund retirement accounts, you'll be back." "No," Amaya said with absolute certainty, "I won't." "And Ben?" The fact that you can't understand why someone would choose love and purpose over security and status tells me everything I need to know about why we were never going to work." After Ben drove away in a cloud of dust and wounded ego, Amaya and Wyatt found themselves alone on the porch again. "Did you mean it?" Wyatt asked quietly, his voice carrying vulnerability that made her heart ache with tenderness. "About building dreams together, about choosing this life over everything you had in New York?" "I meant every word," she said firmly, turning in his arms to face him directly. "Wyatt, I didn't come here to escape from something, I came here to find something. And what I found was you, was us, was the life I never knew I wanted but now can't imagine living without." The kiss that followed was different from any they'd shared before, deeper, more desperate, charged with the knowledge that they'd just fought for their future together and won. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Amaya knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they'd face them together. "So what happens now?" Wyatt asked, his forehead resting against hers. "Now we build something beautiful," she said simply. "Together." And as the stars appeared overhead, brighter than any city sky, Amaya knew she'd finally found her way home, not just to a place, but to herself, to the person she'd always been meant to be. Chapter 7. The autumn light streaming through the windows of the ranch office was golden and warm, painting everything in shades of amber that spoke of harvest time and promises kept. Amaya looked up from the education partnership contracts she'd been reviewing to watch Wyatt demonstrate rotational grazing techniques to a group of agricultural students from 3 different universities. The Heritage Breed program had exceeded every projection they'd made. The Highland cattle had adapted to Montana pastures as if they'd been born there, the sustainable tourism component was booked solid through the following spring, and their educational partnerships were drawing attention from ranchers and conservationists across the entire region. But it was the wedding ring on her finger that caught the morning light and reminded her of the real success they'd achieved, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared dreams, and love that made everything else possible. "Mrs. Boone," called out Dr. Callie Sutton, approaching the office with a clipboard and a smile that had become familiar over months of working together on livestock health protocols, "the new arrivals are settling in beautifully. I've never seen heritage breeds adapt so quickly to a new environment." "The secret is proper preparation and patience," Amaya said with a grin, unconsciously echoing a phrase Wyatt used regularly about everything from training horses to building relationships. "Speaking of preparation," Callie said with knowing look that suggested she'd been talking to Mavis, "I understand congratulations are in order?" Amaya's hand moved instinctively to her still flat stomach, where the tiniest beginning of their future was growing. They'd only confirmed the pregnancy the week before, had only just begun to talk about how a baby would fit into their carefully planned ranch operations and educational schedules. "It's early days yet," Amaya said softly, but she couldn't keep the joy out of her voice. "Wyatt must be over the moon. He actually cried when I told him," Amaya admitted with a laugh that carried all the wonder she felt about the man she'd married. "Said he'd been dreaming about teaching his children to ride since he was a teenager himself, but he'd never really believed it would happen." The thought of Wyatt as a father, of their children growing up with the same freedom and connection to the land that had shaped her own childhood summers, made her chest tight with happiness. This was what Eleanor had envisioned when she'd written about building something meaningful together, not just a successful business, but a legacy that would endure for generations. As the morning progressed, Amaya found herself moving between the educational demonstration and the ranch office, where she was reviewing contracts for their newest agritourism partnerships. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying in a way her former legal practice had never been, offering not just intellectual challenge, but tangible results and a true sense of community impact. "Knock, knock," said a familiar voice from the office doorway, and Amaya looked up to see Javier Santos holding a bouquet of wildflowers that had clearly been picked by someone with more enthusiasm than skill. "These are from the kindergarten class that visited yesterday," he explained with a grin that spoke to his own transformation over the months since Amaya's arrival. "They wanted to thank the pretty ranch lady for teaching them about baby cows." The gesture was so sweetly innocent that Amaya felt tears spring to her eyes. A reaction that was becoming embarrassingly common since the pregnancy had begun. Everything seemed more poignant now, more meaningful, as if she was seeing the world through the eyes of the child she would soon be raising here. "Tell them thank you," she said, accepting the flowers with genuine emotion. "And that they're welcome back any time." "Actually," Javier said with careful enthusiasm that suggested he'd been building up to this conversation, "I was wondering if you might be interested in expanding the educational programs. My girlfriend Sophia, she's studying elementary education, has some ideas about regular school visits, maybe even a summer camp program." It was exactly the kind of organic growth that made their business model so exciting. Instead of imposing programs from the outside, they were creating opportunities for community members to contribute their own skills and passion to the ranch's success. "Have her put together a proposal," Amaya said immediately. "If it's anything like the quality of ideas that seem to run in this extended ranch family, we'll definitely be interested." The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors, tourists wanting to experience authentic ranch life, agricultural researchers interested in their sustainable practices, local families who'd made visiting the EE a regular tradition. Each interaction reinforced Amaya's conviction that they'd found something truly special, a way of living that honored both tradition and innovation. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most, watching Wyatt work with a nervous horse until it trusted him completely, sharing coffee on the porch as the sun set behind mountains that never seemed to lose their magic, planning improvements that would make the ranch even more successful while preserving everything that made it special. As evening settled over the valley, Amaya found herself back where everything had started. Standing by the corral where she'd first seen Wyatt working with the black stallion that had seemed so wild and untamable. The same horse now grazed peacefully in the near pasture, completely integrated into the ranch's social structure, proof that patience and understanding could overcome even the most stubborn resistance to change. "Penny for your thoughts," Wyatt said, appearing beside her with the quiet ease of someone long accustomed to moving among animals that responded to calm more than noise. "Just thinking about how much everything has changed," she said, leaning into his warmth as his arms came around her from behind. "A year ago, I thought my life was completely figured out. Career, relationship, future, all planned and predictable and completely wrong for me. And now? Now I'm married to my childhood crush, running a ranch, expecting our first child, and happier than I ever imagined possible." She turned in his arms to face him, marveling at how the evening light caught the silver in his hair and made his eyes look even bluer. "It's terrifying and wonderful and absolutely perfect." The kiss he gave her tasted like promise and felt like coming home, even though she'd been home for months now. Some feelings, she was learning, never got old, never lost their power to make her heart race and her knees weak. "I have something for you," Wyatt said when they finally pulled apart, reaching into his jacket pocket with a quiet excitement that hinted at its significance. He pulled out a small leather journal, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. "This was Eleanor's," he explained softly. "Her private journal from the last few years. Mavis found it when she was cleaning out the storage room, thought you might want to have it now that we're expecting." Amaya accepted the journal with reverent hands, understanding immediately that this was more precious than any inheritance document or business plan. This was Eleanor's final gift, her thoughts and dreams and hopes for the future made tangible. That evening, after sharing dinner with their extended ranch family, after discussing the next day's schedule and celebrating the week's successes, Amaya finally found time to read Eleanor's journal. What she found there brought tears to her eyes and a sense of completion to her heart. "I see the way Wyatt looks at her pictures," one entry read, dated just 2 years earlier. "The way he's never seriously courted anyone else, never let himself believe he might deserve someone as accomplished as Amaya has become. That boy has been carrying a torch for so long, that he's convinced himself that loving her means wanting what's best for her, even if that means staying away. But I think he's wrong. I think what would be best for her is coming home to someone who sees her strength as something to celebrate rather than something to manage. Someone who wants to build dreams with her rather than fit her into his existing plans. Someone who understands that the strongest partnerships are built on equality and mutual respect. I pray I live long enough to see them figure it out. But if I don't, I hope this ranch, this land that shaped them both, will be enough to bring them back together. Some love is too strong to stay buried forever. The final entry, dated just weeks before Eleanor's death, was even more poignant. Amaya called today to tell me about ending her engagement. She sounded lost, unsure of what she wants or where she belongs. I wanted to tell her that home is waiting for her, that love is waiting for her, but some discoveries have to be made rather than told. I'm leaving her everything. Not because I think she needs the inheritance, but because I think the inheritance needs her. This land, this legacy, this chance at happiness that's been waiting years for the right moment. May she have the courage to choose love over security, dreams over safety, home over habit. And may Wyatt finally understand that he's worthy of a love that chooses to stay. Closing the journal, Amaya sat with the echo of Eleanor's faith in them, an understanding that some connections endure, no matter the years or distance between them. She'd known, somehow, that the love between Amaya and Wyatt was the kind that endures, the kind that grows stronger rather than weaker when tested by separation and time. What did Eleanor think? Wyatt asked, settling beside her on their bed and pulling her close. That we were worth waiting for, Amaya said softly, her hand moving to rest on her stomach where their child was growing. That some dreams are big enough to build a lifetime around. As they settled into sleep in the bedroom that had witnessed so much family history, Amaya marveled at the perfect rightness of everything that had led to this moment. The broken engagement that had seemed like failure, the unexpected inheritance that had felt like burden, the fear of returning to a place that held so many complicated memories, all of it had been necessary preparation for the life she was living now. 1 year to the day after she'd first returned to Montana, Amaya stood in the main barn of the Double E Ranch, watching their newest educational group, a class of urban teens learning about sustainable food production through hands-on ranch work. The program had been Sophia's idea, and it was proving so successful that they had a waiting list of schools wanting to participate. But it wasn't the professional success that made her heart swell with pride and gratitude. It was the sight of Wyatt working with a nervous city kid who'd never been within miles of a cow, showing him how to approach the animal with respect and confidence. It was the way the other kids hung on his every word, absorbing not just technical knowledge but life lessons about patience, responsibility, and the satisfaction that comes from honest work. It was the knowledge that their child would grow up in this environment, surrounded by people who understood that the most important things in life, love, purpose, community, connection to the land, couldn't be bought or sold, only earned and cherished. "Beautiful sight, isn't it?" said a familiar voice behind her, and Amaya turned to see Mavis approaching with a thermos of coffee and a satisfied smile that spoke to dreams fulfilled. "The most beautiful," Amaya agreed, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Eleanor would be so proud." "She is proud," Mavis said with certainty. "I can feel it every time I walk through this place, see how you and Wyatt have taken her dreams and made them bigger and better than even she imagined." As if summoned by their conversation, Wyatt approached from the corral, leading the black stallion that had started everything. The horse that had once been wild and untrusting now moved with the calm confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it belonged. "How's our boy doing?" Amaya asked, reaching out to stroke the stallion's neck. "Better every day," Wyatt said, his eyes meeting hers with warmth that still made her pulse skip after all these months. "Turns out he just needed to find the right home, the right people who understood what he was capable of." The words carried layers of meaning that had nothing to do with horses and everything to do with the journey they'd all taken to get to this moment. "Just like the rest of us," Amaya said softly, her free hand moving to rest on the small bump that was just beginning to show beneath her shirt. That evening, as they sat on the porch swing that had witnessed so many important conversations, Wyatt pulled out a worn cowboy hat, not the competition hat he'd placed on her head at the rodeo, but an everyday working hat that bore the scars and stains of daily ranch life. "This was my first hat," he said, holding it with the kind of reverence usually reserved for family heirlooms. Eleanor bought it for me when I was 11. Said every man needed a hat that knew the weight of honest work. He placed it gently on Amaya's head, and she felt the same sense of belonging she'd experienced at the rodeo, but deeper now, more complete. Now it's yours, he said simply. Because you've earned the right to wear it. The hat was different from his competition hat, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. It held the story of a life lived with intention, daily choices made without applause, and commitment that doesn't shout, but stays to build something lasting, one ordinary day at a time. Perfect fit, Wyatt said, and she knew he wasn't just talking about the hat. As the stars appeared overhead, brighter than any city sky, Amaya thought about the journey that had brought her here, from the suffocating perfection of her Manhattan life to the beautiful imperfection of ranch life, from the hollow security of a relationship based on compatibility to the thrilling uncertainty of love based on recognition and respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that some dreams are worth the risk of failure. But tonight, wearing Wyatt's hat and his ring on her finger, Amaya finally understood Eleanor's last lesson. The biggest risk isn't choosing love over security, it's spending your whole life in the wrong kind of safe. Some connections are worth more than all the safety in the world. Some love is worth the risk of having your heart broken all over again. And sometimes, coming home means discovering that you were always meant to be exactly where you are, with exactly the person who's been waiting for you to realize that dreams don't have to be practical to be perfect, they just have to be shared. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't leaving everything behind, it's coming back to claim what was always yours. Have you ever discovered that the very thing you ran from was exactly what you needed? Share your story of coming home to yourself in the comments below. And if Amaya and Wyatt's journey touched your heart, hit that subscribe button to join our Dear Love Diaries family. Tomorrow we'll share another story of love that's worth the wait.